All right, here we are for section 4, last section of chapter 9, sustaining the wild species and our ecosystem services. In section 3, we talked about HIPCO, the things that are leading to species extinctions. Now we're going to look at some of the specific things that we as humans and countries are doing in order to keep it from happening, to keep the extinctions from happening, and to sustain a lot of these wild species. We're going to talk about several of the acts here. Now, it's not that you have to remember everything about these acts. As long as you know the big picture, which ones they're targeted at, you'll be able to pull them out when you need them. So here we go. Some of the ways to reduce species extinction and sustain the ecosystem services which they provide, which if there's nothing else, as humans we do care about having air and water and food, is to establish and enforce national environmental laws and international treaties. Because we know, if we simply tell you, hey, it's a good idea not to, if it's not against the law, we're going to do it. If there's not penalties or fines associated with something, then somebody says, well, there's nothing really wrong with it. So we have to have laws and treaties to do it. Once again, they're not going to go into the forest and catch a whole bunch of birds to try and come sell to America if we're not going to buy them, if we're not going to allow them into the country. So if they're not going to make money from it, they're not going to do it. So some of these international treaties really cut down on a lot of this activity. Once again, if it's completely legal and it's a good way for me to make money, why not? But if I'm not going to make money doing it, I'm going to find something else to do. We want to establish these laws and treaties, and we also just want to create some protected sanctuaries. Places where you can't go hunt or you can't take anything there, it's base, right? Like in tag. Once they're there, they're safe. You can't do anything to them. All right, let's take a look at a few of these treaties and laws that we have already created. So many of these laws and treaties exist. Some of them might need to be strengthened and we might need some new ones, but let's take a look at what we have. The CITES, C-I-T-E-S. This was started in 1975, and it is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. Flora, fauna, just meaning are we talking about fauna, animal, flora, plant. Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. So you're talking about moving endangered species from country to country. CITES is the law that protects that. Another one of these is the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. This one commits governments to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss. So we want to keep as much biodiversity as we can. It was ratified by 196 countries, but not the United States of America. Go figure. It's not unusual for us not to ratify. 196 countries, the U.S. not one of them. And unfortunately, this Convention on the Biological Diversity also lacks enforcement mechanisms. So even if it's, because a lot of times things are living on people's private land, like I have an owl that happens to live on my property. So backing this has been a little bit tough. But we do have this convention to protect biological diversity. Also in the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act. So started in 1973, it's had several amendments to it over the years, but the core of it is to identify and protect endangered species. So this is an endangered species, and then the second part of it is to come up with a way to protect it. It creates recovery programs for these listed species. So the condor, it got down to 9 to say it's completely endangered, and it had a recovery program. They were literally captured, they were kept, they were bred till we had sufficient numbers, and then they were re-released. Identification and a way to protect it, to bring it back into the wild. The National Marine Fisheries Service is specifically designed to note ocean species, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for everything else. So it kind of has two components, if you will. National marine fisheries are identifying ocean things that may be coming extinct. U.S. Fish and Wildlife identifies the other. If you're running into a scenario and a question, say, which law is, well, look at what is its core. If it is protecting endangered species, then it's going to be the Endangered Species Act. If it is looking to protect biodiversity, then it's going to be the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. If it's talking about transferring or moving organisms, specifically endangered species, from one country to another, then it's going to be the CITES, Convention on International Trade. You don't need to know everything about each of these, but you need to know their big basics. Is it endangered species between countries? CITES. Is it talking specifically about protecting biodiversity? CBD. Is it talking about the restoration and protective of endangered species in the U.S.? Then it's going to be the ESA, Endangered Species Act. Know the big thing that it's going after, and you'll be good. With the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, it forbids federal agencies, with the exception of the Department of Defense, from funding projects that would jeopardize or endanger threatened species. So if somebody says, ooh, I want to do we're going to do this and I need this land, we're going to mine this, we're going to get this thing. If it's going to affect an endangered species, they can't do it. The only one that we allow that to is the Department of Defense. If it comes down to national defense, like we're not going to be a country with it, then we make an exception. It does require commercial shipments of wildlife to come through certain ports. So we have only certain ports in the country that wildlife from other countries can come into. So we can identify and control. So anything coming in, we can specifically look at. In 2015, there were 1,661 species that were officially listed on this. So any kind of transfer of these animals, we want to stop, make sure it isn't happening. 90% of the organisms or the species on the ESA are recovering at their projected rate. So what they do is they identify the animal, and we say this is our recovery procedure. Now it may have taken decades for that animal to get endangered, and the recovery plan might be decades long to capture and plan whatever they're going to do. But they have a 90% projected rate of recovery of the animals they have identified. Pretty darn good for an organization that is not all that well funded. In 2018, we had some changes to the ESE by the Interior Department. In other words, the Department of the Interior of the United States of America. They now allow economic factors to be used in listing and delisting the process. This is not really a good thing. They're saying, hey, if we can make a lot of money by driving them off of this land, then that needs to be a factor to move them off the list. So these changes to the law are not helping the species, they're making it a little easier for somebody to profit. Anyway, the changes were to allow economic factors to be a part in do we remove them from the list or not, to downgrade the protections for threatened species, to make it more difficult to list a species as threatened, and also to decrease or eliminate the use of climate change. And hey, you can't use climate change as a factor in determining it. These are aspects that have weakened the Endangered Species Act. When it first came in, it was pretty strong, but a lot of people have worked to try and go against this, because if there's an endangered species on this property and I want to do something on that property to make a profit from it, I can't. And a lot of these things are designed specifically not thinking about the endangered species, but thinking about profit and growth, just what is actually occurring. What is recommended by the National Academy of Sciences, largely what I just mentioned, is what politics have done, what politicians have done and changed to the law. However, the other side, when it's been looked at by the National Academy of Sciences, their recommendations were to increase the funding, to emphasize developing recovery plans quickly. What is it that we need to do to identify and protect core habitats? If we can protect the habitat first, then we don't even have an animal on the endangered species list. So if we can protect the ecosystem instead of the species, we're much better off. And we also think we need to give assistance to landowners, people that do own the land, that have the protected owl or lizard or salamander, whatever it might be. They need some sort of assistance. They need to know how to go about it, what to do, some kind of helps. So the recommendations by the National Academy of Sciences is virtually in direct opposition to what the politicians have actually done. Something to think about as we move along, and many of you do go into politics. Keep the environment in mind when you get there. Another thing that we have done to protect them is come up with wildlife refugees. Once again, you're playing tag, I'm on base. That's what a wildlife refugee is. It's a base for the organisms, the animals that live there. They can't be touched, they can't be harmed. It's a protected area. In 1903, Theodore Roosevelt established the very first federal wildlife reserve. That was in Pelican Island, Florida, for the brown pelican. It was a reserve. That way they couldn't be hunted, nothing could be done there, it couldn't be developed, we couldn't put houses on it. A refuge. Many more wildlife refuges have been created. Most are wetland sanctuaries, especially in Florida. We have a lot of wetland sanctuaries. These provide habitat for 1/4 of all the U.S. threatened or endangered species. So any harmful activities such as mining, drilling could be for oil, etc., using off-road vehicles, however, is actually legal in most of these refuges. Even though it's a refuge and you can't hunt, we still have a lot of harmful activities going on that degrade, once again, one of those HIPCO things, wind up degrading the habitat. We're doing something about it, we're just not 100% there yet. Another thing that we're doing is the creation of seed banks and botanical gardens. Seed banks. Now, a seed bank is just what it sounds like. Like a bank is normally for money. I take my money and it's safe there until I need it. Well, that's what a seed bank is. We store seeds. Now, we don't only store seeds that might be from endangered or threatened species, we store seeds of all kinds. There are even specific ones. They're like wheat banks and rice banks that store different species of rice. But these are designed to preserve the genetic material of endangered plants. We tend to keep them in refrigerated so the seeds stay cool, low humidity environments. Once again, many seeds sprout when it's warm and humid, so cool and arid or dry tends to keep them from from sprouting, which is the goal. We also have a lot of botanical gardens. Here in Gainesville, Florida, we have the Kanapaha Botanical Gardens. These contain living plants, and you can go and see plants from various places all over the world, local to here and exotic as well. And on our botanical gardens, just around the world, it's not just the one here, but everywhere, represents 1/3 of all the known plant species. Because in one botanical garden, you'll tend to have thousands of different plant species because they're being looked after and cared for very specifically. We also have arboreta. An arboreta, or arboretum, is a place that has specifically trees and shrubs. Now, botanical gardens will have all kinds of things: flowers, lily pads, trees, shrubs. An arboretum is specifically trees and shrubs. And a lot of times we'll have endangered species and threatened species there as a place to kind of watch and observe, and other people can come see them and learn about the conservation. Another thing that we have that helps preserve a lot are just zoos, aquariums, and wildlife farms. So when we get an endangered species, once again, tigers, rhinoceros, elephants, this might be the only place some of these animals wind up surviving outside of a specific preserve. Well, some of the things that we do when we have them in the zoos, aquariums, these wildlife farms, especially endangered animals, is to try and get the population higher. So we'll do things like egg pulling. We'll do captive breeding. We're doing that with pandas right now, trying to get pandas to breed in captivity. It's proved quite difficult. We'll do artificial insemination, just like IV for humans. We literally take the semen from an organism that we've taken, and we take the eggs out of the other, and in the test tube, if you will, do artificial insemination, and then we can transfer the embryo back into the female to carry it for birth. We'll do embryo transfer. Sometimes if we have so few organisms, we'll try and get another animal very close to it to raise it for it. So we could put a valuable tiger egg inside of a lion. They're so close that the lion can bring the baby tiger to term. So sometimes we can do an embryo transfer to a very similar species. Because we may be talking about one particular type of pelican. There are a lot of species of pelican. We use incubators, so we can, instead of having the mother having to sit on the eggs or keep them warm, we can do it in an incubator and make sure all of them hatch, none are lost to the wild. And then cross fostering. Once again, we have a little baby lion, but we don't have a lion mom and dad, but we have a tiger. We'll let the tiger raise the lion cub. Do this cross fostering, because many animals will raise something kind of as its own. My daughter has a flock of ducks, not truly a flock of ducks, but she raises some ducks. And she also has a goose, if you've seen one of the Be Awesome videos about Gustav the goose. But it's hilarious. The ducks just raise the goose as if it was its own. Of course, now the goose is twice the size of all the other ducks. But cross fostering, one of the ways that we're trying to help protect species. The ultimate goal of any of these captive breeding programs is to release the organisms back into the wild. We did this with the condor. There's only 9 left in the wild. We captured all of them, captive bred for about 20, maybe 30 years before releasing them back into the wild. Now, a captive population has to number at least 100 to 500 individuals before we can even consider releasing it back into the wild. Because once they're released into the wild, there's going to be rapid loss. Some of them won't be able to make the transition, some won't be able to catch food, some of them won't be able to protect themselves because they're not used to other predators. So we have to have at least 1 to 500 before even considering it. Public aquariums are really good because they really provide education. They're not really effective gene banks. They just require so much water, etc., to try and have exotic organisms there or endangered, large enough to breed them to a big enough population to re-release in the wild. But they do provide a really good opportunity for education about how we should treat animals out in the wild. And then also just wildlife farms. Wildlife farms will raise these endangered species and then maybe for commercial sale. They may sell them to zoos, etc. All of these are really good ways. Captive breeding programs so that we can release them into the wild, aquariums and other farms, etc., that really provide education for what it's like. And what can you do? What can you or I do? Well, there's a lot of things we really can do. You know, once again, don't buy things like furs, ivory products, or anything that would be made from an endangered or a threatened animal species. Because if we don't buy it, they're not going to sell them. So that's just a huge aspect. Don't go after any of these items. Don't buy wood or wood products that really come from old growth forests. Sometimes they say, ooh, yeah, this is from a... You don't want something from an old growth forest. We want to protect those and tell friends and relatives these same kind of things. And we want to use the precautionary principle. We want to act to prevent or reduce harm if it starts to be needed. It's better safe than sorry, right? Let's act on the front end of things. We don't want to wait till something's endangered before we say, ooh, we have a problem. Let's notice the problem early. Do everything we can to reduce harm. I'm a huge fan of renewable energy sources, solar, wind, various things. Because if it's all said and done and the only thing we did was make the air cleaner, that's not a bad thing. There's no downside to using solar energy. There is a downside to using fossil fuels, so let's minimize it. It's just being precautionary. Act to prevent or reduce harm if at all possible. If we can prevent exposure to harmful chemicals in our air, water, food, etc., once again, this is just a good thing. And we want to have an emphasis on preventing species extinction. If there's an emphasis, we don't want organisms to go extinct. And if all of us learn or tend to act early instead of late, it is much easier. What's the old thing? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's much easier to prevent something than it is to cure it once it's happened. This precautionary principle. Protecting species and these ecosystem services does raise a lot of difficult questions. Once again, should we focus on protecting a species or should we focus on protecting the ecosystem? It's not always the same thing. We have a limited amount of money and resources, so which should we go after? If we protect the ecosystem, it seems like we also protect the organism and a lot of other things. But it's a question we have to ask. And can I effectively protect it might be easier to just protect this one species, but it's a question. How do we decide which species gets attention? A lot of times we simply protect those that appeal to humans because it helps awareness. The American eagle was in serious decline in the 60s, but by preventing DDT and some of this bioaccumulation that we talked about earlier, helped the species recover. But what species do we actually go after? What criteria? What makes this one more valuable than another? Now it may be, well, this is a keystone species. Okay, we need to put more resources in a keystone species because it affects a lot of others. But it's a question. How do we decide which habitats to protect? Do we go after wetlands? Do we go after coral reefs? Do we go after forests? Do we go after grass? What is it? Which habitat? Once again, limited money, limited resources, we have to make decisions. So how do we allocate those resources? How do we allocate manpower? How do we allocate money? We have to make decisions, and it raises difficult ones. Now, currently, we are hastening the extinction. Humans are the leading cause of the current mass extinction event going on of wild species and degrading these ecosystem services, mainly because the destruction of habitats, introducing of invasive species. We've done a lot to bring species from here because of our ability to globally travel, whether it's airplanes, ships, you name it, and just our increasing human population growth. Humans are growing at just unprecedented rate, and the human growth population brings with it pollution, climate change, and over-exploitation, because once again, just our needs or our desires. We should avoid causing the extinction of wild species because these wild species provide vital ecosystem and ecosystem services. We want to be able to breathe and drink water and have food, and they're necessary for it. Their existence should not primarily, however, depend on their usefulness to us. They do have a usefulness, but that shouldn't be the primary reason. We can work to prevent the extinction of most of these species. Some is going to happen. There's nothing we can do about it. But we do want to protect our overall biodiversity as much as possible. We can do that by using the laws and treaties we already have, possibly strengthening them. And we really need to protect our wildlife sanctuaries. The sanctuaries we already have, once again, they need to be strengthened. We probably don't need to be mining and drilling for oil in a sanctuary. We've eliminated hunting and certain things, but we can do more. So tying this whole chapter together real quick, we talked about the honeybee populations have been declining and some of the reasons why, and the fact that you and I need to act to prevent species extinction. This preserves our biodiversity. It preserves a lot of these chemical cycling that we need, and it's also ethical. Now, the last thing I'm really going to bring in for us here is the power of the vote. When you go to vote, we tend to think, ooh, I'm going to vote for the president, or I'm going to vote for the mayor, I'm going to vote for the governor. Well, there's all kinds of things you wind up voting for. Circuit judge, a county commissioner, a school board employee, but also environmental concerns. on every ballot I've ever gone to, that I've ever cast a vote, there's some sort of environmental laws that we're looking to put on the books or take off the books to make stronger or make weaker. You need to know what those are before you go to cast your vote, so you know which way you want to vote, because sometimes they're worded a little funny. But as a concerned citizen, we need to cast our vote in all of the elections so our opinions are known and we affect the actual outcome. That is it for Chapter 9. Take care, guys. We'll see you next time.